Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, or even good morning, depending on where you are joining us from today. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion. I am Kay Jowers. I direct the Just Environments program for the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability and the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, and I'm excited to serve as moderator tonight. I want to begin by acknowledging that what is now Durham and Orange County, where many of us are joining from this evening, was originally the territory of several native nations, including the Tutilo and the Saponi-speaking people, and many of their communities were displaced or killed through war, disease, and colonial expansion. And today, this area is surrounded by contemporary native nations, the descendants of the Tutilo, the Saponi, and other indigenous peoples. And these nations include the Haliwa Saponi, the Saponi, and the Okanichi Band of Saponi. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Tonight is the first of a series of events that the Duke University and other area universities and the community is hosting, honoring the 40th anniversary of the birth of the environmental justice movement. And we are excited to start that conversation around the intersection of environmental justice, climate justice, with voting rights, and to have a discussion about how voting rights intersect with issues that come to us from strategies and tactics that are disruptive and related to protests. So wanted to link the midterm elections that are happening this fall with the things that we're celebrating around the birth of the environmental justice movement. So to the partners tonight that put this program together, we want to thank the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, the Southern Environmental Law Center, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, and the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability, and the Duke Polis Center for Politics. So we are very excited to have our panelists here tonight. And I'm going to start with a brief introduction of them and then give them an opportunity to tell us about their work. We have with us today Jennifer Lawson, Kim Meyer, and Allison Riggs. Jennifer Lawson is a civil rights and voting rights advocate and television producer and former programming executive for PBS. She worked as an organizer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Lowndes County, Alabama, during the height of the civil rights mobilization there. Her work of late has been focused on preserving and archiving the work of advocates and passing that knowledge on to students and youth who are continuing the push for social justice and environmental justice. Allison Riggs is the co-executive director of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. She leads their voting rights work, and over the last decade has been fighting for fair redistricting plans, fighting against voter suppression, and advocating for electoral reforms that would expand access to voting. Kim Meyer is a senior attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center and leader of SCLC's Government Accountability Initiative. She successfully argued before the North Carolina Supreme Court for the North Carolina NAACP in a groundbreaking case that challenges whether a racially gerrymandered legislature can amend the North Carolina Constitution. She's been involved in many cases involving climate change, including reaching settlements with the North Carolina Department of Transportation that resulted in unprecedented environmental protections and a number of new statewide climate change policies. Thank you all for being here and your willingness to share your expertise with us. I am very much looking forward to this conversation. As you all know, as the panelists and I have discussed, I've prepared a couple of brief questions, but wanted to start by giving them each around 5 minutes to give us an overview of their work and how it intersects with voting rights and environmental justice. Jennifer, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to do so. And I'm here really as a witness from another world, from a world that fortunately doesn't exist with the intensity of that it once existed. I grew up in the 1950s and 60s in Alabama in a time of intense racial terror and enforced segregation. and egregious inequality. Black people were denied the right to vote, and whenever small groups amassed any semblance of challenges to that order, people were threatened, were sometimes lynched, unjustly arrested, and churches and homes were burned. Racism played a major role in the physical setting of where people lived, worshiped, obtained their food, and were buried. Prohibitive zoning laws and covenants governed where people could own land, build or buy a house, locate a school. City officials would routinely claim and assign land for garbage dumps, for waste disposal, including hazardous waste to communities of color where people of color lived. No considerations were given to the hazards of industrial byproducts, the proximity of sewer lines and treatment plants, high voltage electrical wire, and when it came to zoning or permitting such constructions within Black communities. The suburb of Birmingham, where I lived as a child, called Fairfield, was so polluted with iron ore from the Bessemer blast furnace that I assumed that the night sky was indeed red. Our homes, our cars were always covered with a fine red grit. Many men in the community worked long hours in coal mines without protective equipment and developed Black lung disease. Today, we're talking about this intersection of protest, voting, and policy in relation to environmental justice. My life as an activist started with protest. I was 16 years old. Martin Luther King was in Birmingham jail, and I joined hundreds of other students to protest. Some were attacked by dogs, by police dogs, forced to turn back by fire hoses, and others of us were arrested. We were protesting. Why? Why protest? What other resources did we as kids and as people in that circumstance, what other resources did we have to make our voices heard? We had to use our voices and our bodies. So in that circumstance, protest was, for us, the absolute only choice. I later became a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC as it's called, and I joined hundreds of students who staged sit-ins, freedom rides, to desegregate buses, trains, public transportation. And again, we were using our bodies in protest to say that we object to these circumstances. But even then, we all realized that protest was not enough. One grows weary marching, picketing, boycotting, and to push for change, we sought the vote as a means of participating in a democracy and obtaining the kind of power and authority that we felt we needed in order to make the changes in our society. Our protests of the 60s led to some legislative changes, particularly on the federal level, that forced the elimination of some of the most heinous policies that were perpetuating a life of impoverishment and inequality for so many people. So you had the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Bill in 65, and that those came about in part because of the kind of activities of people protesting in those years. But many of us then in the civil rights movement, moved from protest to education and political life because we felt that the vote in itself is not enough. There has to be a purpose, a goal for the vote in that respect. So we moved from protest to voting and then to action on particular issues. My work today is in preserving the history of the civil rights movement, and that we've been working now with Duke University in creating, we have an archive there with the Franklin Center, and that it is the SNCC Legacy Project, and it's called the SNCC Digital Gateway. And I'd be happy to talk more about what we're doing and about this intersection between politics, voting, and environmental justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Allison Riggs, would you like to give us an overview of your work, please?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. So pleased to be with you this evening, and particularly to speak with such respected other panelists. My name, as mentioned, is Allison Riggs, and I'm the co-executive director and chief counsel for voting rights at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. And I'm very excited to be able to talk about the work that we do, because I think it captures some of the intersectionality that y'all are trying to highlight for the students at Duke and the broader public of systems of oppression that particularly have impacted voters of color throughout the South and throughout the nation. So at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, we use what is called a community lawyering approach. So it's very holistic, where we recognize that we are in partnership with grassroots groups that are agitating and advocating for long-term structural change and to advance their own political, social, and economic rights. And as part of that work, we have programs in environmental justice, voting rights, and justice system reform. While I have litigated most heavily in recent years voting rights cases, I've also litigated environmental justice cases. And we view our work, and it's not just those program areas, but anywhere where systems of oppression have acted to harm Black voters, voters of color, folks of color. It's not uncommon to see a sort of layering or multiplying effect of those systems of oppression. That is, when we do our work, we frequently find the same communities that are experiencing environmental injustice are the same communities that are underserved and over-policed, are the same communities that are excluded from the political process, are the same communities just excluded from having a voice generally. And that these challenges have a compounding effect on each other. We're very careful as a part of our voting rights work to make sure that that work is, and work we do to support political participation, is non-transactional, which means like we're not standing out arguing for, everyone should just go vote for the sake of voting, right? Because that's what I mean by transactional, is that we're not talking about the policies impacting people's daily lives, and recognizing that, with limited resources and time, if the choice is between, getting your children fed and housed or voting, you're not having a conversation that's actually about making people's lives better. I obviously believe that voting is important and that fair representation and reduced barriers to political participation are critical. But part of the voting rights work and civic engagement we do is a broader lens on accountability. And so making sure that we're talking not just about the importance of voting, but the importance of attending local meetings where decisions are made about schools, about police, about the environment, because the right to vote without that follow-up rings a little bit hollow and doesn't effectuate change. And so when we advocate for the proper resources, for example, in North Carolina's coastal areas that are ever more, and not just North Carolina, but we're in North Carolina today. So when we advocate for more resources to be appropriately directed to communities that are going to be hurt by the worsening climate crisis in terms of hurricanes and flooding, we also recognize that those same communities are going to be, if a hurricane hits, not only are folks going to lose their homes and their work, their children's school. They're going to be displaced. They won't have a political voice, absent a recognition of their rights. And all of these things need to work together, both to make a democracy that lives up to its promise, that is inclusive and participatory, and to make the policy changes that we need, particularly in keeping our communities safe and healthy. So I'm so pleased to be in this discussion with you all tonight, and really looking forward to the event.
Thank you. And Kim Meyer from Southern Environmental Law Center.
Thanks, Kay, and good evening, everybody. It's so great to be on this panel of all women. Very exciting way to kick off this great celebration of environmental justice. So as said, I'm Kim Meyer. Until very recently, I was Kim Hunter from the Southern Environmental Law Center. I've been working here in Chapel Hill for the past 12 years. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Southern Environmental Law Center, we work across the southeastern United States on a whole range of environmental issues, everything from forests to coasts, clean water, clean air. And of course, for us, environmental justice is not one particular segment of what we do, but it's something that we really recognize runs through all of our work. We are primarily attorneys. We spend a lot of time in court, but we also do a lot of work at different levels of government, federal, state, local, lobbying, organizing, working with communities, really whatever tools we can use to make change, with that fundamental focus being on the environment of the Southeast. And thinking about some of our work and listening to Allison, I think we are both getting to this place of intersectionality of interest and important issues, maybe from slightly different places. I think Southern Environmental Law Center has come from this sort of ground up level where we're focusing on these particular communities historically is what we have done. And now over time, we're starting to realize that in order to support those communities on the micro level, we also have to be involved on the more systemic macro level and thinking about the systems in play which lead to these environmental injustices in the first place. So while a lot of my colleagues' works and some of my work focus on, particular projects, highways, which are going to harm or cut in half communities of color, produce more air pollution, environmental harm, have more costly tolls, so this community can't even leave them, or maybe you've got a polluting factory which is located next to a less fortunate community without really a strong voice. While we do a lot of that individual project work, what my work has increasingly focused on is more of this higher, bigger picture level of making sure that everybody has a voice. So I am now SELC's government accountability leader, and just some examples of what that work looks like. So when we think about having a voice, the first thing what we're thinking about today a lot is voting. And we have seen Greenpeace has done some really great work on the intersectionality of environmental justice and voting rights, and showing, for example, how gerrymandering has a strong correlation with the cleanliness of air. The more gerrymandered a district, the more harmful air pollution there is in a district. So we know that those sorts of patterns exist, and as North Carolina and particularly African-American voices have lost power in North Carolina, we have started to see over the past decade what that has resulted in across a whole host of issues, including environmental issues. So because of that background, SELC has jumped into some more like voting rights type work, and particularly a case challenging what power does a racially gerrymandered General Assembly have? So that's one of the big cases that we're working on right now. Some of my other work, which also relates to this idea of making sure everybody has a voice, is maybe a little more traditionally environmental. So I'm the lead attorney challenging President Trump's rollbacks to the National Environmental Policy Act, which is really our bedrock environmental law for making sure that all voices, but particularly environmental justice communities, have a voice in projects which are going to affect their communities. And then closer to home, a lot of my work focuses on keeping North Carolina's government accountable under the Public Records Act, most recently with our Rules Review Commission, which is sort of stealing power from the people again, and just really working at this higher level of systems and thinking about how do we make sure our government is accountable, how do we make sure voices are being heard, and how does that lead into decision-making that is going to ensure that everybody has the access to the clean, healthy environment that we all have a right to. So excited for this conversation, and I really love the way that this intersectionality has started to really gel over the past few years.
Thank you all. As we alluded to earlier, we're approaching this really important midterm election in the United States, and next week, starting the anniversary, the 40th anniversary of the events that many point to as the birth of the environmental justice movement, the Warren County protests from 1982. And when we think about the right to vote and to participate in free and fair elections and voice your choice for the candidate to represent your perspectives, that's really the core of our democracy. But so is the right to assembly. The right to join with your fellow citizens and express your views through protest. One, the voting, is a very institutionalized form of influence, and the other is often extra institutional. And the latter has been essential over the last 40 years for communities experiencing environmental injustice. So that begs the question that I wanted to start with the panel tonight of, are voting rights truly essential for achieving environmental justice? And what do you see as the link between voting rights and the right of peaceful assembly?
Do you have a preference of who goes first?
Ooh, please jump in.
Well, I'll go quickly and then defer to my colleagues. I will say, first, North Carolina has, I think, a particularly special place in history of recognizing attacks on voting rights are attacks on all of the issues that we care about. So one is just looking at the mid-2000s when we started the historic Thousands on Jones Street. The HK on J coalition was a coalition, is still a coalition of over 200 organizations of all orientations, right? So there were environmental groups, reproductive justice groups, like you name it, really brought together. Reverend Barber brought folks together to recognize that when we have shared issues and concerns and are falsely divided and don't recognize those, that's a problem. And then that sort of, some of that energy shifted to the Moral Monday movement in 2013. And that was really triggered by the repeal of a key part of the Voting Rights Act. And so I guess it was almost 10 years ago. It feels like yesterday to me. But the folks who were in the General Assembly, in that building, the People's House, being arrested and voicing their vehement opposition, not only to voting rights attacks, but the failure to expand Medicaid and all of the things that were harming economically disadvantaged communities across the state, historically marginalized communities across the state. That voice gave the voice that folks willing to put their physical bodies on the line. And this goes back to what Jennifer is documenting the history of the civil rights movement, that absolutely is critical to our ability to talk about what is holding folks back in this country. It's structural and systemic oppression, and it infects so much of our policy. And I do think that, it's hard, particularly as a Voting Rights Act, but we do have to acknowledge that our democracy that we put on a pedestal hasn't worked for everyone. It hasn't, it only at the 19th Amendment started working for white women, and Black women, it took longer, and it's still not perfect, right? So our democracy, we hold up on a pedestal the promise of it, but we really have to keep making it work for everyone. And when it does work for everyone, I believe the policy will achieve those policies, including keeping people safe in their homes, in their communities, in their environment. But that we get sort of stymied by the fact that our democracy isn't the inclusive multiracial democracy yet that it promises to be, but we're moving toward it.
And I think voting plays a critical role in being a way of talking about the voice of a community. I think, obviously, I believe strongly that there is a role, and an important role, for protest. And that I think that is something that that we will continue to see. I think that after the murder of George Floyd, the number of people all around the world who went out into the streets in protest was, sort of exemplified that ability to have our voices heard as a community about issues. And so I do think that marching with our feet, making our voices heard, will always have a very important role. But I think it's not enough. It's not enough, and that if it's overemphasized, there's the element of, there's grave danger. There's the potential of chaos, police actions, and that can escalate into something horrific. And none of us would want that. So I think these things always have to be balanced and have to include then key and clear strategies. What is it that we are working towards? And what then can be used as information, education, to help galvanize a community.
Thank you. I appreciate the also pointing out that the Voting Rights Act was the result of mobilization and protest, and one of the outcomes and successes of protest. I wonder.
When we say success, I worry, my colleagues and I worry that we're seeing all of this, just like sand on the beach being washed away.
Right, exactly. The rollbacks and eroding of those rights. And that's where I wanted to go next in talking about the role of protests and how it's evolved. And Kim, I wonder, could you speak to maybe how protest and organized action have evolved over time and play a role in environmental justice?
Sure. I think what I was getting ready to say, that I think the moment we're in right now, and maybe why these issues have intersected more, but also why it makes it more difficult and complicated, is as we have become more polarized, there is less sort of factual debate or ability for, working across party lines on issues. And I think that has really changed over the past 10, 20 years. I know certainly for some of my colleagues who maybe 15, 20 years ago, you could think, okay, here's this environmental issue. We're going to educate about it. We're going to talk about it. We're probably going to be able to get some votes here or there because this affects these people's community and everyone drinks water. And there was some hope for coalition building around issues. And that just seems less and less true over time. And it's more about this power struggle and party politics, which I think makes the voting issue much more stock in some ways. But it also makes protest, I think, a little bit more complicated too, because protests that we've seen on both sides, protests and people voicing their opinions in a more physical presence sort of way, can be very polarizing also, and can sometimes, I think, backfire, which is not to say it's not hugely important. And as we've seen over the past few years, a really important way to build community, to love each other, to feel empowered. There's so much great things that can come out of protest. But at the same time, I think we've seen how that form of action has been used against certain movements. So I think it's really tricky. And I think what is great is this coalescing of not just environment and voting rights, but a number of progressive issues, advocates coming together and realizing we're all kind of in this space, aiming for the same thing, which is this multiracial society where everyone has a voice and we take care of each other at a most basic level. And because of the threats which are upon all of us, we have this more coming together and maybe a more hopeful path forward.
Thank you. So it sounds like protest still has a place, particularly in our democracy where we still haven't fully realized the giving everyone a voice and a right to participate in the free and fair elections. So protest certainly still has a place, and especially in the fight for environmental and climate justice. I wonder if you all could speak to, have you seen how recent protests affect decision-making? Have you seen an impact from the protests of the last 3 years and some of the environmental justice or climate justice debates? And do those protests seem to impact voter behavior?
I'll speak to that real quickly. I don't know about voter behavior, but I will say, using the National Environmental Policy Act as an example, this has been the bedrock environmental law in the United States since 1970. But it's not a very sexy one. It's about process. It's not the Clean Water Act. And I think has gotten a fairly bad rap and is seen as a little boring and something that slows things down. But what we have seen over the past 5-6 years is the environmental justice movement really picking up with that law and realizing how important it is, because what NEPA does is make sure that everybody gets information about what is happening to their community and gives everyone a voice in that process. And so right before the pandemic, we saw big rallies in DC from the environmental justice community and allies like us. And we definitely saw the effect of that in the political process, that suddenly this was an issue that was raised, that progressive politicians suddenly cared about and saw why it was important, and not just this kind of boring procedural law. So I think in that stupid way of just like elevating issues, it can be hugely successful. And then the other way I've seen it really be successful is when we're on the super local level. And that's really where you have a lot of ability to make change and make your voice heard, because everything's much less diluted than it is at a national or statewide level. But I think folks starting to mobilize around particular like localized environmental injustices we've seen be very effective throughout the state.
I guess I'll just add, if Jennifer doesn't have any, voter behavior is multi-causal, so I'm not aware of any studies specifically linking turnout to environmental justice wins and that kind of thing. But it, protest linked to voter behavior that then connects to environmental win. But what I will say is, the history of the environmental justice movement, birthed in this state is long and storied, and it's not new. But I do think, like Kim is right, there's like a renewed or a heightened attention to it, using the appropriate language. And so what that tells me is that we've gotten better at telling our story or getting the media to cover the story using the right words and really describing the inclusive and intersectional effect. So I think that's, that does a couple of things, right? It affects our ability to change or talk about policy, and it informs voters, right? Voters decide when and how to engage based on what they see around them. And so it's a win for us all when we get the national media to talk about Flint and talk about it in a way that's not just like, oh, here's an economically disadvantaged community and also their water was poisoned. Whoops, right? Like to talk about how that was the effect of systemic racism and how that coverage and that discussion matters, and it's going to affect what voters know going into the ballot box, and that's a good thing.
Thank you. Jennifer, did you want to add anything?
Just to say that very sadly, that after Flint, now we have Jackson, Mississippi.
Yes.
And it's like, as Allison was saying, it's good that there is that kind of coverage of it, and enough in the news that tells about the sort of history of why that has happened to that particular community. That way, and the ways in which systemic racism played an important role.
It sounds like this strategic advantage and influence that protests can play is still incredibly important, even as we are approaching an election. I want to open up to the audience questions in just a moment, but I am curious about what you think that people could do, those who aren't community organizers, social movement organizers, or voting rights attorneys and attorneys. What could everyday people do to influence this coming season and celebration around the birth of environmental justice, or make sure that there are free and fair elections in our country? Would you recommend protest, registering people to vote?
Well, and I thought Allison stated it quite well when she talked about how it's important not to just blanketly sort of say, oh, everybody has to vote. I think that has to be connected to the reality of people's lives, and that we need to do as much as we can to work with communities to help people understand the absolute importance of the vote to a democracy. But I think that there's right now, I'm particularly concerned about young people, college age students who are sort of, who cares? One group is just as bad as the other. So there's a kind of cynicism and apathy that is frightening when you consider the consequences of inaction. When people don't vote, then they really are voting in one sense by allowing then an even smaller minority to make the decisions for them. And I'm not sure that we want to live with the consequences of that. So I think it's really critical for us to work across issues, across communities, to really ensure that people understand the importance of participating in the society.
I think the good news for folks listening and folks who may watch this later is that there's a role for all of us to play. Some people are drawn by the action involved in protest, and that's fine. Whatever. We also need people to go to city council meetings, go to county commission meetings, and learn about the decisions that are being made, because to use Kim's words, like, that's not sexy all the time, but it's so important. And guess what? Most of these young folks are on social media, right? So they can share, it's a learning thing. You don't have to like understand everything about county budgeting the first time you go. But if you're starting to build relationships with decision makers, that's going to help. One, you hold them accountable, and two, you can be such an important conduit to your colleagues, your cohorts, the people in your social networks, your age groups. So, and you don't have to go to all of them. You don't have to go to Board of Elections meetings, city council meetings, all of it. Pick one, and talk about it, normalize it, make it seem sexy and fun. You can also join a group that approaches voter engagement from a multi-issue standpoint, right? So join your local NAACP branch. Join a group that is binding folks together. So you don't have to solve all the world's problems or figure out exactly how to plug in. Join in with a group that's going to give you some support in figuring out how to plug in. We believe at SESJ, we believe that structural change is going to come from the ground up. And it's going to be no single voice, no single person, but the binding together of people for a common cause is what's going to ultimately change this country for the better. So just plug in. You don't have to solve everything or figure out any sort of magic bullet. Just join with people who are striving to make a difference and can help you plug in.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think the key thing is, don't just show up to register some voters and knock on doors in, October, because that's, those politicians, whoever they are, we don't know what they're going to be doing after that. And if you're only engaged on and not staying at whatever level of government, I think the local level is so important, and in some ways easier to enter into, because it is your neighbors and your very close community. But whatever level of government it is, or maybe it's some particular commission or the Board of Transportation, or thinking more about our courts, just staying engaged and really advocating on those issues consistently and holding everybody accountable, because I think there are a lot of folks from all parts of politics who make a lot of big promises around this time of the year, and then we don't often see them actually play out. And we know that it's big money and loud voices that gets action. So whether that's protest, or whether that's showing up at committee meetings, or going to meet with your elected representatives, I can tell you, even at the state level, there are so few people who do that. Just a call to your legislator every week or every month even is going to be enormously effective. So I think the bottom line is, do what you're passionate about, because then you're going to keep doing it, and have fun with it, build community with it, empower others, and just have some hope.
I get a little jealous when I hear people talk about being active on the local level, since I live in Washington, D.C., where we have taxation without representation. So we don't have people on Capitol Hill that we can go to in that way.
One of the million ways our democracy hasn't lived up to its promise yet.
Yes, exactly. But I echo what you're saying of the importance of, particularly, of holding elected officials accountable, and also of being very supportive of as much independent media as possible too. So that, because I think it's getting harder and harder to parse the truth and to get accurate and factual information. And so that becomes really important as well.
Well, speaking of difficulties getting factual information, Cameron Oglesby has been helping to gather up some of the audience questions and comments, and social media is coming up as a theme across a number of the questions. So, and Allison, you alluded to it, and I think all of your answers pointed to the importance of people physically showing up, having a physical presence at a public meeting, doing something, but also we've alluded to the power of the media. What do you all think about social media, and is it the new protest zone, or has it reduced the power of protest?
Oh, I'm trying to like kick back my cynicism a little bit. I think there are some folks, like I don't know if this is specifically sort of political, and I mean not partisan political, I mean political and how our system works. It makes political commentary a little easier, right? You can sort of couch surf and do it at the same time. I don't know that, the folks who it took to the streets after the murder of George Floyd, like I think that those folks, like, and there have been and there continue to be these kinds of rallies and protests disclaiming frustration and outrage at systemic oppression and racism. I don't think we've gotten to a point where I'm worried about social media per se, but I think folks need to be, and obviously we've had a global pandemic thing going on for a few years now, which changes people's calculus in deciding to go out into public. But I think it's one thing we can all be vigilant about, is that social media is great for educating folks, and the reality is there are a lot of people out there watching social media, so it's a good mechanism, but it's also a place where disinformation can spread. And this is just my opinion, it's never going to replace a conversation person to person, human being to human being, and we do tend to dehumanize people on social media. They're just little icons, or a tweet it's an unidentified tweeter person. I don't know what the right word is. Plainly, I'm not the social media maven. But I just think we need to be vigilant and think about it. And to the extent that we are making our voices heard as a collective, as a group, or trying to influence policy outcomes and fight for environmental justice, there's a piece where social media has its lane and plays its role. We just need to be vigilant that it doesn't decrease our ability to communicate with each other and bind together in person, and that it doesn't become a replacement for that, whether it's in the form of protest or if it's in the form of showing up at your county commission meeting to understand what we're spending our money on, and to have an opinion on it. It's not going to be the same doing it on social media.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I mean, that's a great way to organize people. It's a great way to find people, right? Like find them in the first place. And that can be good or bad, as we have seen, sort of like-minded people who might not have found each other previously suddenly can come together and feel that their opinions are valid. And that can be a wonderful thing, or it can be a slightly frightening thing. And it can be a great way to alert folks about some big issue or a new law or public comment period or community meeting. It can be a great way of getting the word out. But I agree with Allison, there's nothing like human to human contact. I always I was a community organizer before law school, and my key was always to feed people. And that is still a big part of what I do today in my work and in my family political life, is feeding people, coming together over food, laughter. That is what builds community, and that can really translate into action in a way that you can never do online. So I think there is a lot to be afraid of. I think it can be really powerful in some ways, but it absolutely has its limits.
No, and I echo what Kim is saying there, where I think ultimately being in those situations where you can be with people physically, where you can feed people, where you can eat together, talk together, that those are the best moments, because it's also part of what building community is about, building trust. And I think it's very hard to sort of build trust through tweets or through, you know, the glamour of the Instagram post or something. But I think it's so important to be able to talk face to face and to meet with people and to be able to exchange ideas in a much more spontaneous way. So that human contact, and particularly meetings and the ability to learn from each other, becomes absolutely essential. And it's not just learning information, it's about emotion.
Yeah, so it sounds like social media as an instrument to facilitate that relationship and trust building is incredibly important and will continue to be. I think we have time for one last audience question, and I think this question about some advice to students is a good one. Many of our students are policy students or environmental science students, and really want to tackle these big issues of environmental injustices and climate injustices. And they're often taught to think that cost-benefit analysis, economic analysis, research, and science are the answers and the key to change, rather than strategy and power building. I wonder what advice you might have for them.
I can start. I mean, first of all, everyone needs to bring the skills and the passion that they have to the table. There is room for everybody. I was personally an environmental science major in college. And as I mentioned, Dan was a community organizer after that on environmental issues. And ultimately, for me, thinking about the changes I wanted to make, law school seemed like it was going to be helpful and something that I was really excited about, but that's certainly not for everybody. So whether it is that you are bringing this really important data to the mix through your research, or whether it is that you're just a great host and love to have everybody over for dinner after doing a community cleanup every week. There's so many different ways to jump in, and I wouldn't want to give advice that there is any one way to do it. I think like just following your passion is what's going to keep you in this fight in the long term. And bringing the skills that you are really skillful at is what we all need you to do. So find what you love, find what you are good at, and then, work with others to find the best way that you can put that to the best use.
And in the civil rights movement, there's a song, there's even a TV series that uses that. There's a title called Eyes on the Prize. And the idea of the song is, to me, it's, that have a vision. What's the vision? And that how then do you maintain the focus on that vision? And that's keep your eyes on the prize. And I think that we definitely need you. We need all of you, your expertise, all that you're learning. We need your skills, all the facts and data that you're gaining in your education. We need you desperately in helping to right the wrongs that have been perpetrated. And that when you think about the field that you're in and you talk about environmental justice, then for me, that sort of sets a vision, in a sense, of where your eyes need to be focused in the sense of righting wrongs, as opposed to, and so whether it's a cost-benefit analysis, if it's perpetuating the same problems that we've had in the past, then it may be a good cost-benefit analysis, but to whose benefit? And so that's where I hope that you will take your skills, your abilities, and then look at how you can correct some of the wrongs of the past and make our society a much better one.
Ditto and ditto. And I just add that the problems that we're seeking to solve are so big that we need everyone's creative insights. And, you know, we who've been in this work get a little bit sometimes siloed, and we need another perspective. And so there's space at this table of justice for everyone. And I am not an expert in everything. I guess most of us agree with that, but you all may be. And collectively, we can solve these problems, but it's going to take everyone. And, you know, if you're called to be a tax attorney, I'll go ahead and throw lawyers under the bus. If you're called to be a tax attorney, it doesn't mean that you can't still work for the greater good. You can do it in your free time. You can do it in the pro bono cases that you take on, if you take them on. Like, there's always a path to make this country a place that lives up to its promises.
Thank you. Thank you all. What a wonderful note to end on, the power of collective action when we've been talking about voting and the right to assemble. Thank you so much, Jennifer, Allison, Kim. We appreciate your time and your expertise. And thank you so much for what you're doing in the world. Thank you for everything that you have done and do every day. Thank you all for coming. And please come to the future events in this series around the 40th anniversary of the birth of the environmental justice movement. I believe the next event that Duke will be hosting is going to be on the 14th, a panel recalling the Warren County protests with some of the original protesters from the actions in 1982. So please join us then, and thank you again for being here tonight. Thank you.